Let's have a look at question 39 in this video. So we have a survey of 1,500 Canadians that revealed that 945 of them believe there's too much violence on TV. In a survey of 1,500 Americans, 810 believe that there's too much violence on TV. Now the 99% level, significance level, we conclude that the proportion of Canadians and Americans differs. So we are testing a difference on proportions, meaning that the null hypothesis that we have is that the proportions of Americans that believe there's too much violence on TV is the same as the proportions of Canadians, and the alternative is that they differ, Now, how are we going to test this? Well, we're going to have a z-test on difference between proportions. So let's write here the z-test and we're going to discuss it in a second. So we're going to have the difference in proportions between the Canadians in our sample relative to the Americans in our sample, divided by the standard deviation, which is the proportion overall from the population who believe in violence, times 1 over the number of Canadians plus 1 over the number of Americans. So we have this like that. Now, why do we do this test? What we're testing here is whether the proportions of the Canadians differs significantly from the proportions of Americans based on our sample data, because the sample data, the proportions that we have in our sample is going to be an estimate of the proportions of the proportion of Americans that believe there's too much violence on TV in the entire population. And the same analogy goes for the proportion in the sample of Canadians, which is an estimate for the overall proportion of Canadians in the population that believe there's too much violence on TV. So if we have a large enough difference between these two, we could claim that there's a large enough difference in the entire population. So let's calculate all these values. We need the proportion for the Canadians, for the Americans, and the overall proportion of people who believe there's too much violence on TV. So let's calculate everything here below. Let me zoom out to have more space, and let's solve them here below. We have the proportion of Canadians in our sample. That's the number of Canadians who believe there's too much violence on TV relative to the total number of Canadians in our sample, which is equal to the number of Canadians who believe there's too much violence is 945 relative to the number of observations, that's equal to 1,500. If we solve this, we get a proportion of 0.63, so 63%. Now with the same logic, we work out for the Americans, which is going to be the ratio between the number of Americans who believe there's too much violence relative to the number of Americans in our sample, and that is going to be 810 relative to 1,500 again, because we have 1,500 Americans in the sample. And that's going to be a proportion of 0.54, so 54%. And now one more thing that we need is the proportion overall. So the total proportion of people who believe there's too much violence on TV relative to our entire sample. So that's going to be the total, the number of observations for Americans plus the Canadians relative to the total number of observations, which is equal to 810 plus 945 relative to 1,500 plus 1,500. If we solve the math over here, we would have a 0.585 proportion. Now with these values, we can actually compute our z-test, our z-statistic. So let's get some space here below and do that. Our z-value, our z-statistic, is going to be the difference between the proportion of the Canadians, which is 0.63, minus the proportion of Americans, which is 0.54, that's based on our sample data, divided by the standard deviation of the proportion in total, that's 0.585, times 1 minus 0.585, multiplied, here we have 1 over the number of Canadians in the sample, which was 1,500, 1 over 1,500, plus 1 over 1,500 for the number of observations of Americans in the sample. Now if we solve the math over here, we're gonna get a value of 5. Our z-score, our z-value is gonna be equal to 5. Now let's have a look again at the question. We're testing a two-sided hypothesis. So we want to have two tails in the rejection region, meaning that if we draw the z distribution, over here, we will have at the 5% significance level two critical values, which are gonna be 1.96 and minus 1.96. So this is 1.96 critical value. This would be a rejection region, and another potential rejection region is to the left of minus 1.96 over here. And our z value that we just found is equal to 5, which is far in the rejection region on the right, meaning that we reject the null hypothesis. So the proportions between the Americans and Canadians who believe there's too much violence on the TV differ significantly. The proportions differ significantly. And that's it. Hope this makes sense, and we are done.